And we're back. It is COMP397, and it's the winter 2016 semester, and it's week 12 of our broadcast. I don't know if it'll be a part 2, so let's leave it at week 12. So what are we doing here today? We're going to talk a little bit about the state of affairs of your project. I'm going to go around and sit down with each of the teams, like we've done in other courses. Like I said, I'm going to talk about your final exam, which is going to be worth 40% of your mark. And I'm lying. There's no 40% of your mark. I just want to see if you guys can pay attention to what I'm saying. There we go. There is no final exam. There's, we're going to do some other stuff with this course, right? We talked about it before. So, so you want to be a good web developer, eh? How about those conversations? We'll do those things. We need to know a little bit about sprite sheets with Canvas. We're going to talk about that today. How to put together, how to use that with your preloader. So load up a sprite sheet, do a little bit of animation, that kind of stuff. That's going to change our map a little bit when it comes to the custom classes we built with Create.js. Because one of the things we've been doing with Create.js when we use our custom classes is we've been what we're doing is we use them as bitmaps, but they can't be bitmaps anymore, right? Once we start getting into sprite sheets, they all have to be, all the objects have to become sprites. And when that comes into play, so there's several changes we need to make for our project for it to work with sprite sheets. We'll talk about that today. There are some other things we can do as well that I've covered in several other years that I've done this kind of course, right? Like, for example, particle effects and physics, if you're going to do some kind of platformer or 2D platformer, and tile mapping and so on. And it really depends on the cohort, the class that I've been dealing with. They kind of drive me to do another example or whatever. Just because of this year, the crunch we've felt because of days we've lost because of vacationing and all that, different things. I'm not going to do another teaching period next week. So we're just going to use it purely for workshop and for marking and for review of the work. Get you guys on track, solving problems. If you got a problem, those are the things that I like to try and use that for next week. So next Friday again, I'm going to be here. I'm going to be here with the teams, hopefully marking your stuff, getting you all up to date, and then getting you ready for the final week of classes, which is the following week, where we do a bit of a presentation, which is what I'm hoping you'll do for in class. That'll take care of the last bit of your 15% that's left over. Okay, so that's what we're going to be doing. I'm going to be outlining the presentation details to you next week, and there will be it'll be a group effort. And all that I'm going to ask you for is a PowerPoint presentation with a few slides that are going to detail what your project's about, 5 minutes to speak and demo it, and that's it, and then you get your marks. Okay, so very, very straightforward. And we'll mark you as we go, so there won't be any kind of, big criteria, that kind of thing that'll prevent you from getting your marks. The other thing is that I'd like to try and stick to the timeline because we only have 3 hours, right? It sounds like it's a long time to do presentations, but really it's not, right? You'll see that 3 hours gets eaten up very quickly when people have questions like, how did you do that? And, I would recommend doing blah, 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 and some other things. There's no recommendations at that point because your final project's been submitted. This is just your presentation. So you're presenting your final project. It'll be maybe a bit of fun to see your classmates and what they've kind of put out for this particular semester. Right, so one of the things I have a problem with presentations is when you haven't finished your project. Now that shouldn't be a problem this year because I've been following you every week, trying to make sure that you've got all your stuff. But sometimes presentations go awry because the project isn't completed. And so, if you're not done your project, you can't do your presentation, right? But it doesn't mean that I don't want to give you the marks for it. It just means that you have to be very quick and talk about things that aren't working so you get your marks. So say, hey, I'm doing my project, here's my presentation, project doesn't work. But here's what we got working, kind of thing. As opposed to, there's Francis, as opposed to, trying to stop you from doing the presentation. I've done screencasts as well in the past where you can do a screencast instead of a presentation. Unfortunately for us, there's no time for that this semester. So there won't be a screencast option for your presentations. It'll be purely in class. Which means you're gonna have to be quick. You're gonna have 5 to 7 minutes with your partners to set up and do everything, and then I'll just cut you off, just like we're doing a bit of a game jam, right? It'll be one of those. So you have 5 minutes to present your stuff, and then I'll give you the red light and see you later. It'll be done, right? only because we don't have time. If you think about this as maybe potentially having, we have what, 40 potential people in this group still, in that range, 40, 36, something like that. If you combine with 2 people, let's just say, and the average group is about 2 or 3 people, that means we could have in excess of 15 presentations. 15 presentations at 10 minutes, that's the entire class. And that's being on time, presenting your work with nonstop, right? That's crazy, right? So that's where we're going with that one. And that's why I'm telling you, it's you know, if you're not ready, you're going to present in 2 minutes. You're going to come up and say, well, we're not ready, but here's what we've got. We wanted to make this, and there's no demo to be seen. Thank you very much for the class, and good luck on the next semester. Bye-bye, right? That'll be your presentation. So you won't get full marks, but you won't get 0, right? So what do I mean by that? I mean, be ready, and we'll talk about getting ready next week. So the only thing I'm going to do next week, if I'm going to talk about any kind of learning material or whatever, is what I'm looking for the presentation, which I'll probably record, right? Because I want you guys to be ready to do your presentation. It'll be fast and clean, and you'll be in and out, okay? What it means to me is that, I mean, and some people will say like, so when I'm done my presentation, can I leave? No, right? It's your exam. This is your exam, but you're also helping your classmates out by basically helping them, like giving them some feedback, you know, being an audience for them. They've worked hard just like you have on their stuff, and it's good support for everybody else to stick around and finish the day, and then see you later. Then you can, you know, you've got 2 weeks off before your next semester, right? So that's how it's going to be. If you plan not to attend, I need to know in advance, because it'll affect how we're going to flow things. But at least one of you or your partners, must attend to present. If you don't, 0. Right? There isn't another option. I'm not going to accept the presentation just as a PowerPoint. I will not accept it. You won't even get part marks. Right? It's like your exam. Please take it as such. Right? For this one. Okay. Enough about that. I don't like starting off with dark and gloomy. It's bad, right? And I want to kind of present better things. So let's talk about that today. All right. So we're working with a project that I've been working with for the last little while called. If I look at our COMP397 folder here, we've been working with MailPilot for the last little while, and one of them is online. There's this COMP397 Winter 2016 MailPilot demo build that I've been working with, and you can get that off of GitHub. So I'm just going to extend that one. So if you look at GitHub and you go to Centennial and you look at when GitHub actually works, there we go. Only because of the bad, you know, projection we've got going on here. COMP397 Winter 2016 MailPilot demo. If you go there, that's the project I'm going to be working with, and you know, we've got this. It's working pretty good right now, and I'm gonna use this one as we create our sprite sheets and simple animations, stuff like that we're gonna do. Okay, remember all this stuff that I'm showing you today is bonus for your final project, right? So if you use animations that work well, you know, gain the use of all these things. This is just extra stuff for you to create something that's more interactive for your game. Okay. Actually, it's really nice to have, if you're making an ad, some kind of rotator ad or something like that with Create.js instead of making a game. We need to make them sprite sheets and animate them. It makes sense from a project build perspective, and we'll go over that in a second. All right, so bring up Visual Studio Code just like we have before in the past, and I'm dragging in my Winter 2016 MailPilot demo. Okay, so we're going to bring that up, and we're going to make some changes now to this whole project to make sure. Okay. So I'm going to maximize this so you can see it all. There it is. Now remember what I've talked about before. We have objects seen. This won't change, right? This can't change because our scene objects are the same. Let's review what we have so far, so you see where we're at, right? So it's good. We're going to have to add a few more assets as well. I'm going to talk about this. So I'm going to open this up in Terminal, and I'm going to just run the gulp automation here. And as it pulls up, you'll see that I got MailPilot going on. I click Start, right? I move with my mouse, right? And then I die, and then we're back to the game over screen. So that's really what we've got so far. So there's lots of room for improvement on this one. Certainly, you can make use of web fonts here instead of using the regular font that I'm using here. You can certainly use something more exciting. You know, what I'm asking for you to do, guys, and things that I'll be marking for or looking for your assignments and final project is please don't use any of my assets. I've kind of mentioned this before. It's just mark loss for you guys, right? So, I mean, there's plenty of assets out there you can find. Mine are just for demo purposes only. They're not for us to reuse, you know, in your assignments. Okay, and I mean anything, sound, graphics, whatever. So let's take a look at this. So we've got our, I'm going to kill some of these things that I've got open here. I've got lots of stuff open. So I want to change some stuff. I want to make this, reorder my project, so I use sprite sheets, right? Well, the first thing I got to look at is, number one, is my, in my scripts folder, I've got a game.ts file that I'm going to be looking at. And so far, we have this asset manifest that we've loaded up, and we have a start button, a restart button, a back button, all kinds of other stuff in here. This is nice. It's nice. But the problem with this is, again, I'm loading each asset individually, right? And sometimes this takes up an additional load to load all this stuff up, right? Like the ocean GIF, the plane, and all that stuff. Some things we can combine into a sprite sheet though, and sometimes we don't want to. We want to leave it as a separate asset. And what I mean by that is, if we keep these as separate assets, I've got to load them up for the first time. You know, it's loading time. But there's going to be some, if we combine into a sprite sheet, like for example, the ocean, which is massive, right? For me to add that into the sprite sheet will make my sprite sheet considerably bigger, which I don't want to do, right? So the first piece I want to do is, how do we combine stuff into a sprite sheet? And anyway, and I talked about this at the beginning, there's a really neat app that you can download for your Windows or Mac, or I'm not sure if it's available on Linux, but it's called Texture Packer. Right? Texture Packer is also available to use with Unity, right? So if you're a Unity person or Unreal or some kind of game person, Texture Packer is the app that you want to download for sprite sheets, for 2D animation and so on. It's quick and easy, and it allows us to drag and drop assets. And no, I'm not going to update right now. I'll remind me later. But what it allows us to do is, depending on what type of what we want to create, I want to create a new project here for a second, right? What I want to do is I want to export a certain type of project, right? So one of the things that you can do when you have a new project is decide what type of output you want, right? Because depending on the type of output, as an example, you can choose the output for Unity, you can choose the output for Create.js, and for other things. So one thing is we have to drag and drop our sprites. Now, if you don't have this already, you can certainly download it. There is a trial period that you can use for this one, and it should be available on the machines in front of you. So if you don't have access, you can certainly use the machines that are part of the school machines that you can access, so you can try them out. It should be part of that as well. All right, so let's talk about this. So I've got some assets, and remember that I've got access to my files, right? And in my assets folder, I have some images. And again, sprite sheets, again, for us, are going to be simply done with assets that we drag and drop into the Texture Packer that are 2D. You can drag in PNG assets, PNG images, GIF images if you want, JPEG images, and so on. I've already got a bit of a project going here, right? And it's called mailpilot.tps, but I'm going to replace it with my own. Okay, so a brand new one. Already got it here inside the Mailpilot build. But let's try this out. So if I was going to make a new one, which ones do I want to drag and drop? And again, this is dragging and dropping from your operating system into this area. You can also add sprites manually up here for this little interface, or you can add a whole folder. And what this will do is add all the sprites in the folder. Why do I want this? So what I want for sure is these plane sprites, plane 1, plane 2, plane 3. Why? Because each of these plane sprites, and I'll drag them in a second, you'll see, here they are. I'm going to drag and drop them. They are individual plane sprites that go the wrong way. That's not the one I want. Tom. Let's just undo these things and kill the sprites. See, I told you there's a reason why I didn't want to include this stuff. Let's go to new project. Let's try that again. What I want to do is I want to get the original sprites for this project. I have these 3 plane sprites, but for now, let's add in ocean, island, and plane. So here's my plane. to my plane sprite. Why is this way today? It's amazing to me why this gets added in. The other thing is it's probably the way that this is working out. Let me just curious, because things have changed for Texture Packer, I must say, right? So, and over the last little while, that's what I'm expecting. This is what I was expecting. This is actually the project that's actually in this. If you have Texture Packer, let's start with this project. How about that? I've just dragged and dropped a bunch of stuff. There we go, right? Why? Because you know what? I'm not going to try and figure out what happened. And I don't have the time today to do that. But I have this project that I have a restart button, a start button, this plane that's up and down. Oh, here it is. The data formats is the one I can choose. This is why it was the way it was. Let's try that again. Now I'm more curious than ever, right? So, but if you want to, at least it's up online. So if I change the data format to create.js, which is easel.js, right? And again, I can search for it. So if I say create.js, there it is. I can choose that data format. In the past, it was a project choice. Right now, you know, it's not a project choice anymore. You have to kind of just choose the data format. Then I can drag and drop. Now let's see if it does it right. Right? Yes. Thank you. That's what I was expecting. I was like, hold on a second. Why is this doing this? I definitely have my other buttons here. It's my restart button. I want to have that in there. I definitely want my start button. That's also there. I have my cloud. Here's my cloud object. And also I have an island object. I'm just dragging and dropping this online with you here. You can see that. And so that this is what my sprite sheet is going to look like. I have a sprite sheet of a combined sprites. They all come together in one image. And it's going to be a ping image, right? And instead of loading all this stuff individually, which makes no sense, I'm going to use a different way of loading everything by using this new format, the sprite sheet format. What I won't do is this. See this? Here's my ocean. And if I drag my ocean in there, it's too big, right? It's massive. The ocean takes up more room than anything else. And it's not a great fit for a sprite sheet. If you're going to use one single GIF image like this that just, you know, doesn't do anything, it doesn't animate or anything like that, use it as a bitmap. That makes more sense. So we're just going to, you know, kind of remove that ocean from our sprite sheet. I'm just pointing it out so that if you wanted to drag and drop everything, some things don't make any sense. Okay, I only have one image of my plane right now. If I was going to just recreate my mail pilot with a sprite sheet with no animation, I could certainly just use this, right? But I want a few more images of my propeller, right? Because if you zoom into the actual plane, you can see that there is no propeller movement on it at all, right? However, I do have some objects here, and hopefully this will work better this way. Let me just get rid of this plane. So I go to plane and get rid of it, and just drag in the 3 plane objects that are here. So I'm going to take these 3 plane objects, plane 1, plane 2, plane 3, some assets, and drag those in. Now you see that there's 3 plane objects, right? And they almost look identical, but actually it's not true. Each plane object has a different state. So if I was to look at the actual images themselves, let's bring them up in Fireworks for people who are interested. So here's my plane 1. And if I zoom in, you can see that, take a look. Look at my propeller. My propeller is to the left, right? And if I look at plane 2, right? Here's plane 2. And if I zoom in, my propeller is to the right. So what it's doing is just going like this. It's just swapping right left to make it look like it's animated. That's all. It sounds stupid, but actually it looks like a propeller movement, especially on a 2D object. The rest of the object is identical. So there's no difference between one type of plane and another, right? So I've got 3 planes, plane 1, plane 2, plane 3, an island, a cloud, and some buttons. I don't think I need anything else for my UI right now because those are the only ones I have, right? I want to definitely export it to something called Atlas. I want to create a texture atlas, right? Or a sprite sheet, whatever you want to call them. They mean the same things, okay? A restart button, start button. I also have some other buttons here. The next button. Do I need a next button? I don't need it, and I haven't used it in my application, so I'm not going to include it in my sprite sheet. Okay, so what do I do now? So now that I said my format is easel.js, right? I want to declare what it's going to, how it's going to save. Notice that there's 2 options here on the right. One is the JSON file that I'm exporting to. So I'm going to just choose the JSON file. So I'm going to go back into my project, and look at COMP397. There we go. And inside my mail pilot build, which is over here, inside here, inside my images, where I have my JSON file, I'm going to choose atlas.json as the name of my file. Save. Replace. I'll do this in a second. Then I'm going to publish for the first time. Same thing with my texture file. My texture file is an atlas.ping file, right? So I'm going to just choose that. Oh, man, what the hell? It's one of those changes that, you know, to an application, you're like, this was fine before. Why did you break it, right? Anyways, doesn't matter. We're going to work around it. I'm going to call this Atlas as well. Save. But what I want to do now that I have mentioned, I've kind of indicated what the names of the files are, because it's going to produce two files. One is a JSON file. The other one is a texture file or another ping image that I'm going to use. All right. I want to publish the sprite. So if I click Publish Sprite Sheet, what it's going to do, it's going to go out there and write back everything. And notice this, my sprite sheets is 444 by 180. That's what it is. And so it's going to combine this whole thing into one sprite sheet for my game. Okay, cool. Got this part done. Let's take a look at my objects now and see what I've got. I've got my atlas.ping and my atlas.json file, but they're now part of my project. And if I look back on here, oh, one more thing I should probably do is save my project as mailpilot.tps that you can load in your version of Texture Packer, so you can follow along with what I'm doing here. And again, you can download Texture Packer as a trial, and I highly recommend it. So you don't have to. You can also do this by hand if you really want to. I definitely don't recommend that, right? Just a waste of your time. Okay, so now that I've got everything saved and we've got our project, inside my assets in my images file, I have something called an atlas.json file. This atlas.json file basically does a couple of things, right? Well, one thing I don't need is this reference to my texture packer. It's nice. I don't need it. Let's get rid of it. And just to keep on track with everything else, right, I'm going to upload these changes to GitHub. So you have what I have now. Okay, so just in case you don't have texture packer, you still have the JSON, the atlas.json file, and you still have the atlas.ping file, so you can follow along with me, right, if you're interested. So I'm going to go up here, and I'm going to say added atlas, texture atlas. Right, there we go. And I click this checkbox, and I'm going to push it up to GitHub. There we go. All right, so once it's done pushing to GitHub, and that may take a while in this room, you have a couple things here. I have images. My image that I'm loading up, it's an array of strings, and the image that I'm loading up is atlas.ping. There it is. And here's my frames. And notice when I say frames, right, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 frames. And I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 objects that are being described. One of them is cloud. Cloud, and this is a frames is an array of arrays. Okay, so here's my array in the JSON format, right? And it's an array of coordinates, right? So my first one, which is cloud, the cloud object, so the 0th object in my frames array, that's what it's referring to here in animations, right? So cloud is frame 0, that's what it represents. Restart button is frame 1, this is this one, right? So in my cloud, it starts off, the position is 1, 1 on the texture map, on this new ping image that's been generated. So I position 1, 1, and the width is 226 wide by 178 high. All right, let's check that to see if it's true. And if I go back to Texture Packer, you can see that the cloud is to the left. So 1, 1 is actually up here because the cloud is, it's a rectangle like this. And this is where it starts off. And it kind of calculates how big this thing is. So the texture atlas itself, there's two components, right? One of them is the image, and the other one is this descriptor JSON file that allows us to know where all the objects are on the texture atlas. So if I'm talking about cloud or restart button or whatever. If that makes sense. Okay. So far, so good. We're going to use this as our texture atlas. We're going to bring this into our game.ts file, because this is what we're going to do. We're going to take this file. We're going to assign it to something, a variable that we're going to have access to throughout our application. Okay, that's what we're normally going to do. to get an idea of what's going to be done, I'm just going to close this down for a second. Take a look at the API documentation for Easel.js. So here's Easel.js. And if I look at the documentation for Easel.js here, and if I look at under Easel.js, one day when it comes, one day when Easel.js comes, there we go, and pulls down. And here's my docs, right? If you look down here on the left-hand side, there's something called Sprite Sheet. So I want to take a look at Sprite Sheet for a second. Here's my Sprite Sheet class, and it gives me an example of what frames are. Here's some frames. You can actually mention it by hand. You don't have to use a JSON image or a JSON file to do that, but it kind of gives us an idea of how animations work as well. So here's our animations, and you can also group animations as little arrays, right? My plane then could be an array of frames, right? Which is what it is. My plane will have its original image, which is 0. My image 1, as an example of my plane, which is 1 and 2. But I've got to mention it like this. I got to say, I got to talk about what my animation is called, and inside this object, I've got to say which frames are part of my animation. So my plane will be an animation that'll have 3 frames associated with it. So I got to change my JSON object so it looks something like this. Let's take a look and see how I'm going to do that. So what I mean is I want to call something plane, right? And my plane is going to be an object, right? For now, let's put the comma in there so we don't have an error. My plane object is going to be frame 4, frame 5, and frame 6, right? That's what it's going to be. And if you notice this idea here, frames is one piece, right? Speed is another. Speed is how many frames per second, how fast am I going to be doing this page flip animation. So far my rate is 60 frames per second. If I only have 3 frames, you realize how fast my propeller is going to go? It's crazy. I might have to slow it down to like 0.5 because I only want, so I can do per object, 30 frames per second. So every other frame I wanted to do the flipping instead of flipping every frame, 30, 60 frames, too fast, right? So 0.5 is actually a really decent thing. So again, the name of my animation is first, right? So again, plane, and then frame would be the next piece, right? So the frames involved. So here's frames. And then as an object, when I put in the frames, right, like it says here, I get to mention which frames they are. Now notice I'm getting a bit of an error, and I'll talk about that in a second. I need 4, 5, and 6, right? So frames 4, 5, and 6 are the frames for my plane. I also need speed. So now our speed is also giving me an error, right? And my speed is going to be 0.5, right? Because that's what I want to kind of put in there. Here's what'll fix it if I do this. If I go frames and speed, right? That'll be just fine. It's the same as if I did it the other way. Now that I've got this set up for my plane, and again, the way I made that is I looked at my JSON output, plane 1, plane 2, plane 3, and I'm just going, it's frame 4, 5, and 6. So I'm just putting in here, frames are 4, 5, and 6, and my speed is 0.5. I'm just configuring my animation. So when I call my plane, I'm actually doing an animation for my plane. I'm not actually just causing one image to appear, right? Let's get rid of this. Now you can imagine this is the same thing if you had an explosion. You might have 8 frames of your explosion that you download from the internet, and all you're doing is whenever you call explosion, it plays the explosion animation until the end. It'll play the whole explosion animation, right? Well, this is what I'm doing here. So let's get rid of these 3 objects. We don't need them anymore, or the comma, right? And now our JSON file looks like this. Let's reformat the code so we can, this is bad, let me undo that. Let's reformat the code, right? So that's just tell you, this is, it's amazing what we can do. And just so we can kind of pan it in a little bit so we can see what our new format is. I'm going to save this file, right? And I'm going to upload this. If you didn't do what I did, I'm going to upload this one to GitHub. I'm going to say updated, atlas.json file, right? Just so that way you have what I have. Updated atlas.json. Click, push. This is for bonus marks, like I said. That's why there's so much work involved. Okay, cool. So I've got this JSON file. I'm not going to access it like this. I'm just setting it up for my use. Okay, let's go back to my API. So here's what I've got. I've got animations, walk, shoot. Here's some examples of walking and shooting animation. I've also talked about I can also indicate my frame rate. it gives me an example of how I set up my stage. But here, my friends, is an example of my data. So here's my data. And notice that this looks exactly like the data that I just got from Texture Packer, right? Instead of me creating this by myself, it's already been created for me, right? And all I have to do is go var and whatever the name of the file is. What do you think I'm going to call it? Atlas, right? I swear it's only going to be called Atlas. I'm going to put this inside of my game.ts file. So let's do that. So clickety-click, go back to here, go to my game.ts file. Right now, again, you could load this up with your game.ts file using your preloader. I don't recommend that right now because that's an extra level of complication to your lives that isn't going to improve your game in any way, right? So just for now, if from an improvement or optimization perspective, yes, it's a good idea. To complicate your lives and make you crazy with errors, no, it's a bad thing. Please avoid, right? So it'll work, but it takes work. And I don't want you to spend your time doing that as opposed to just getting some bonus marks, okay? So let's go back. So I'm going to go back to my game.ts. So I'm just going to close up this images. And I'm going to go to my scripts and go to game.ts. And in here, around the same area that I've got my asset data, right, I'm going to put in my atlas. So I'm going to call, let's be around this before or after doesn't make any difference. I'm going to say var atlas, right? And you can call this texture atlas if you like as well. For now is equal to what? Well, I'm going to go back to my JSON data. Here's my JSON data. And I'm going to grab this file, this stuff, copy it, go back to my game.ts file, and paste it. Yay, there it is. Exactly as it's in your file, right? Now, I've got some duplicates, right? As you will note, right? I've got my asset data right here that I'm loading up. Plus, I've got my assets right here that I'm loading up. Well, here's where the changes come into play. I'm not going to load it up here. My plane, my island, and my cloud are going to be removed from my asset data preload, right? Because I'm doing it this way, right? I'm using my atlas.ping file. By the way, is this the right path for my atlas.ping file from where I sit now in my game.ts? No. You need to give it absolute positioning. And if you notice what I've got down here is still going to apply up here. So I've got to go / assets, right? Images, atlas.ping, which is going to zone into this big atlas file that I got. I'm going to remove engine, cloud, and plane, right, from here. Bear with me while I do this. So these are the sounds. Let's just do the actual things that I really want, Tom. So cloud, island, and plane. There's three ping assets. They're going to be gone. That's line 52, 53, 54 for me. I'm not going to remove ocean because ocean is not included in my sprite sheet, right? But those are no longer available, which means I need some work to do, right? In order for me to make all this work, okay? You'll see that sometimes you may say, for just a little propeller flip, he's making all this work happen. It's true. I'm doing a lot of work for this little propeller flip. I'm just being honest with you. Okay, so what do I do? So here's my frames and my stuff. I've got my atlas. But I need my next step. And my next step, if I go back to my API documentation, says I need to make a sprite sheet object, and I need to pass my data that I declared into this object as a new create.js sprite sheet. Cool. So let's do that where? Well, here's my preload. So when this is finished loading, I want to do something down here, right? I don't want to put it in here, right? Because assets, install, plugin, blah, 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 sound. It's going to preload the stuff. I'm going to skip this piece for a second. We can also put it here if you really want to, because this is where all of our assets get preloaded. It doesn't really matter. But the thing is, on preload, it's going to run the init function, and we don't know because I'm loading it twice in two different ways, this way, and it's asynchronous. But we probably want to load this part first, and then load our stuff down here next, just to be safe. So let's do that. So on load, I want to do something like this. I want to say, we're going to kind of create a space for this in the global namespace, right? I've got my atlas, right, as an example. And notice that I got my assets up here. I'm going to create another one that we're going to call, for now, we're going to call var, and we're going to call this our texture atlas, which is our sprite sheet, texture atlas. That's why I reserved that, which is of type create.js.sprite sheet. There you go, that's the type. Notice that when I hover over Atlas, right, it says the type is actually a custom type. This is the custom type. I could create a class or interface for this if I want to in TypeScript. For now, we're going to leave it as is and allow type inference in this case to take hold, right? Why? Because I'm not really in the mood of creating interfaces for you guys right now that are only going to be for a plain flip animation. It's going to flip its, we're only flipping the propeller here, right? It's a lot of work. In the future, if you're making a more robust game, yes, I create an interface for this. I can make a custom images object and frames and so on to describe what I'm doing here. And then I can load in my JSON data and consume that JSON data in my class, and then my class will have all the details. That's the right way to do it, but it's a long way, and I don't want to do that right now. Okay, so I've got my texture atlas, and now I've got to declare it down here. I've got to initialize it before my canvas and stage and everything else, right? So let's say, instantiate texture atlas. What I'm doing here, I'm going to say texture atlas dot, or is equal to new create.js.spritesheet, that I'm passing in the data, which I'm going to call atlas, right? That's the first thing. So I've created my sprite sheet. Okay. Part two, once I've got my sprite sheets, notice that I got something called animation, and I do a create.js.sprite. I pass in a reference to my sprite sheet, and I pass in a reference to the sprite animation that I'm running. This is how you make the animation. Well, guess what this is? This is how we're going to change our class from a bitmap to a sprite. All my objects are now going to become sprites instead of bitmaps. We might have to make another object in this particular case because our superclass, our game object superclass, is also a bitmap, and we're using it in several other classes, subclasses. Let's take a look at this. What am I talking about? What is Tom talking about? We've done this piece nice. Nice, Tom, nice. Okay, now we have to go and do it over here. If I look at my game object superclass, here's my game object superclass. Notice that it's a bitmap. And when I pass stuff into the constructor, I'm passing in my bitmap string. That's what I'm passing into the constructor. And inside my bitmap string, I'm saying assets.getResults, because that's how we do preloading, and the name of the bitmap. Not so with sprite. We got to say, pass in two objects, the sprite sheet, comma, and then the name of the sprite. That's what we're passing in there. Okay. But what inherits from game object? Because we want to mess things up. Well, we know that island inherits from game object. And ocean, does it inherit from game object? Yeah, it does. This is bad, right? Because island and ocean are both game objects, and yet ocean is not a sprite for us. Ocean is a bitmap. How do we mess this up? How do we fix this up? So we're going to change it from game object. We're going to make another game object called sprite game object or something else like that. And this is a bitmap game object. So my regular game object is a bitmap that ocean is inheriting. And I'm going to make a new game object superclass called sprite game object in our particular case that I'm going to use for our other ones. That's how we're going to solve this problem. Now, there's many other solutions, and in the past, I've done it in different ways, where I haven't even added the game object superclass as a superclass for our ocean. I could also remove that. I could take our ocean out of the superclass, and then we'd be fine. But for now, to make it easy, here's my game object superclass. I need all of this stuff, right? And I need to make it another one. Instead of create.js bitmap, I want to create another one called, very similar to this one, but it's going to be, instead of a bitmap class, it's going to be a sprite sheet. So how do I do that? Or a sprite. So I'm going to copy this game object. So copy, and I'm going to paste, right? So there we go. Here's my game object, paste, right? And notice that it says game object, right? I'm going to recast this thing as sprite game object. Okay. And instead of it being a create.js bitmap, it's going to be, this is the simple way of doing it, by the way, guys, not the most efficient way. Create.js.sprite. Different kind of game object. Now, you notice how all of a sudden my constructor is wrong. Well, yeah, because my constructor has to be wrong, because it's not a bitmap anymore. So it's going to be like me declaring a new sprite, not a bitmap. I think I need to rename this thing. So I'm going to rename this thing, rename. We're going to call this sprite game object, sprite game object.ts. There we go. Save. Sprite game object.ts. I'm getting a bit of errors. Don't worry about that right now, right? Because sprite game object.ts doesn't exist yet, right? It will. And don't worry about how this looks. It says duplicate identifier sprite game object. Well, that's not true. I have to close this down and kind of go up again. One thing to note for sure is this can't be right. And the reason why this can't be right is it's going to be, when we create our bitmap with this one, there's two pieces that we need. One is the sprite sheet, which we know is called texture atlas. So we're going to use that texture atlas. And then the second thing is, instead of a bitmap string, which is right here, right? This is the bitmap string. We need to know what the sprite string is going to be. So we're going to just rename this thing. So we're going to say rename symbol to sprite string. Sprite string. We're going to pass that into the superclass. So sprite string. There we go. And that solves our issues for this. Don't worry about the duplicate identifier. It's going to go away. All right, so that's one. Sprite game object. Cool. It's a type create.js sprite. So far, no objects are using it. Okay. I've just created it so that it's almost identical to what we're doing. It's got methods, the same methods and classes and everything else we had before. And for our plane and island, they're going to inherit those two things. Okay. And also our cloud. That's the other thing that inherits. So cloud, plane, and island are all going to be sprites now. They're no longer going to be bitmaps, which is there's advantage and disadvantage for these things. Oh, by the way, from a performance perspective, sprites perform better than bitmaps do, just in terms of moving around. If I have thousands of sprites on the screen, they're way better performant in create.js than bitmaps. They're just more optimized, from what I've seen. Okay, so I don't need my atlas.json file. Let's just save this. So we're not changing this piece up right now. But what I do need to see, because we've made this new addition, and see how this is all grayed out. It's because of I need to do one of these: close and open. Yay. Now, I want to go into some of this other stuff and attach it. Remember, I can't use my new class, my new module, my new sprite game object, which is way down here right now. I can't use this sprite game object unless it's connected to my files. So in my index.html, notice that I have objects, assets, and buttons. And here's my game object class. I'm just going to copy this listing here and put in sprite game object. There's something else I'm adding in there. Sprite game object. This is a different game object. One's for bitmaps, one for sprites. They're the same thing for now. All right, cool. I'm going to save that. And I'm also going to go into my reference files. So I have a reference file that I use in my core module. I have a reference.ts file. Notice I also have game objects as a reference. I got to make another reference to this sprite game object. Otherwise, it won't get any code hint. And it won't work properly from a build perspective. Sprite game object, yay, done that too. So I've got all the three pieces. I've got my new game object. I've got a reference to it in my index.html, my module, and I've also got a reference to it in my reference.ts file, which is inside my core library folder. Next, I've got to change my objects. First, in my game.ts file, do I have any changes to make? For example, do I have anything in here that I have to change? And the answer is no, because in my game.ts file, there's nothing that I have to change in here, right? This is just a setup file for everything else. How about in my play? In my play file, I do have objects that say objects.island and objects.cloud. Do I have to change these? No, because these are inheriting right now from game object, right? All I have to do is change my other objects in here. It'll be transparent to the rest of my classes. If I go into cloud, here's my cloud. Notice that it inherits from objects.gameObject. We're going to change the inheritance from sprite game object. There we go. Nothing else changes. Why? Because my cloud and my plane and my island are all going to be sprite game objects, and it's going to be transparent to the class what's happening, how it's being created. All right, we're going to see this in a second. So remember, all in my superclass, all I pass in is the name of the object, which is cloud. And if I go back to my game.ts file, right, which is inside my core library again, I have a cloud. Here's my cloud. It's actually frame 0. So that's going to reference frame 0 from this atlas. That's what's happening. and it's going to play it just like we normally would, just with a different method. Instead of saying, you know, assets.getResult, it's just going to do, hey, pass the sprite sheet along with this particular sprite, play this animation. Okay, that's what's happening. Just so you understand the transition that I'm making. So cloud has changed, and I want to just copy this whole thing. So instead of me, you know, typing it wrong, and I want to change island. So here's my island, right? So change that up. Same thing, no difference there. And I also want to change my my player. My plane is also a bitmap. Can't be a bitmap anymore. It's got to be one of these, right? And not a create just. Here's something different, by the way. Got to put it out there to you guys. This is one where we haven't added our plane to the super game object thing, right? I haven't added it in. If I add it in, I'm going to have a lot of duplication in here. So for now, just to show you the difference, I'm going to make it so that the plane itself is just a sprite, not a game object. You're going to say, but Tom, you didn't have to do that. Yes, well, in this particular example I have. This is a different way of doing things than I've done before. Okay, so here's assets.getResolvePlane. Remember what we did in my super game object or my sprite game object. I have a reference to my sprite sheet, which is texture atlas, and then the name of my sprite, which is this particular case plane. My animation that I'm going to play. Otherwise, everything remains the same, right? Save. 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 Okay, yay, almost there. Let's check my collider, because my collider, I got to make sure that it runs properly too, because my collider class is actually a group of, it's in another folder called managers. And if I look at my collision class, what does it do? It says, I want to pass in an object, right? And depending on the type of game object it is, if my object is, for example, is a plane or a cloud or whatever, you know, that's what's passing in. Now, what's not happening is I'm not comparing it with game object or sprite or whatever. Thank God. If I did that, then I'd have to change my code here for my collider. I'm not doing it this way. I'm just saying an object, whatever the object is, right? It's still part of the object's namespace, but I'm not basically saying what type of object it is. I'm not saying it's a cloud or, you know, whatever. I'm not saying that here. Here's where I'm kind of saying that over here. I'm saying if the name is a cloud, I'm comparing the name of the object, not the type of the object, which is my saving grace in this example. Save. Let's do a transpile and make sure that we've done everything correctly. I'm just going to do a gulp for the first time here. And if things work well and there's no errors, it's going to do its nice transpilation here, process, and it's going to work. Now, one thing you need to note, if it doesn't work like this, sometimes you need to run in incognito mode. So we're just going to go localhost 8080, and we're going to refresh. Now we notice that it's working, right? I got this part is working, my ocean. The test is when I go to my start. If I click, well, my start button is actually, hey, that's part of my sprite sheet, right? So that's worked. That works fine as well, right? Hey, is that a problem? Did I do something wrong? Because remember, my button class is using this sprite. Uh-oh. Let's go check. Forgot my button class. So what does my button class do? Because my button class is using my game object as well, right? And how is this working? So I got to be careful because I have a button. Did I load my button in my class? Well, remember what I did? I only moved my plane, my island, and my cloud. Those are the three things I moved, right? For testing purposes. And I did that on purpose because I knew my buttons were, right now they're not sprites. Eventually they will be, right? But let's take a look. So if I go back to my thing, I click start, I see my plane and my island. And this means that my sprites are working as is. And let's take a look at my propeller. It's spinning like crazy, right? You see it? It's hard to see, but if you try it out yourself, you can see that the propeller is actually animated, right? Well, this is the beginning, my friends. Once you've got this going on, right? It's the beginning of adding everything else as a sprite. So let's fix up my button class as well. So my button class right now makes use of the game object superclass and not the sprite game object. And again, I'm just creating this for illustration purposes. Obviously, later on, I would have to optimize and get rid of one of them, right? One or the other and call them something different. But for now, let's do that. So if I go to my button class, here's my button. Notice that it extends, oh, see? It extends my create.js bitmap So what do I have to do here? Instead of my game object, I just make this into a sprite. There it is. And notice that this has to change. My call to my superclass has to change as well. Here it is, right? This has to change. And it needs to do this. It needs to be texture atlas, and then the path string, right? Whatever the path string is, the path to my button. Right, save. So I've got my button, and now my button is also a sprite. So I've got my button as a sprite, my plane's a sprite, my cloud's a sprite, island, right? All those things are sprites. And it saves me loading and all that kind of stuff. Okay, cool. So this is all good. Let's retest. So we go back in here and notice that it's still working. Let's run it into my incognito window to make sure there's no other issues. And I'll go localhost 8080, and if everything goes well, hey, there's my button and it works. And we know it's a sprite because there is no caching going on. To check it, if you're unclear or if you don't believe me, right? Let's try this out. I'll go into inspect, and underneath my sources, I can see that inside my scripts and inside of my game.ts, or sorry, let's go into my objects. If I see super game object or sprite game object, which is right here, it exists. These are all the JavaScript files that it looks for. Well, then if I look at my player.js, notice that it is at the top now. This is the JavaScript version. It extends the create.js sprite class, right? If you wanted to see how it works, right? That's the one thing it does. Notice here's my create.js sprite. That's what it extends, create.js sprite, right? Which is good. It means that it is operating as a sprite as opposed to a bitmap. Let's try this out again one more time. You can see that the propellers are running. If you can't see it, let's really zoom in here. Right, so I'm going to zoom in really crazy and see the propellers running now, right? You see that? This is a much harder way to play. I only have this part of the screen, right? But you can see that the propellers are moving, right? And they're animating. It appears that they're moving at 30 frames per second as opposed to 60 frames per second, which is where the whole game is playing out, right? Actually, I'm better at this way than the other way. Maybe I'll get a good high score. Okay, maybe not. 500 points. Not so much. Not so very good. Anyways, so any questions around sprite sheets? This is the beginning. You can use sprite sheets for whatever you want to use them for. Like I said, for explosions, for some really simple effects that have something happening. A run effect, if you're making a Running Man or some kind of platformer, you want to make the legs move and all that kind of stuff. You can animate them through, by using this way of doing things. You make a sprite sheet first. Now, there's a lot of changes here. But hey, I've just given you my project, and you can always base your project off of mine. You can use my files as examples, is what I'm saying. Don't leave your files, your object shouldn't say cloud and island and plane, okay, or player. It shouldn't say that. You should make it your own, right? But yeah, the example should be up on GitHub in a second. Let's do that. So I'm going to up on GitHub. Notice there's a bunch of changes, and I'm going to say, I'm going to add those in. I'm going to say added sprite game object project, right? And now I can use all that stuff that we've done with our sprite sheets, including texture packer and everything else. All that stuff is assimilated. Right? Here's some concerns that I have about this method. All right, I'm not putting it out there for you because I've done this many, many, many times, right? For you guys, from experience. One thing I can do with sprites is I want to make an explosion, let's say, right? And you would be forgiven to think that I can make an explosion to play a few frames, right? Like, I don't know, a 6-frame explosion. It starts with the point, it kind of becomes bigger, 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 and then you expect it to go away, maybe with some other frames, right? So maybe it's 8 frames, right? And you're like, hey, cool, the explosion is done, right? What's really going to happen is this. The explosion is going to play and keep playing over and over again, forever. How do I stop that explosion, right? Well, there is a leftover from our stuff from Flash. Remember, Grant Skinner, who made this nice little JavaScript API, right? Create.js. I'm just going to stop this and stop this, and go back to our API documentation for a second. Let's go to easel.js, right? just for a second so I can show you what I'm talking about. And then we'll stop for the day and I'll start sitting with everybody. Easel.js, I said. I feel like a wizard with no power. Like, Easel.js, come up, I summon you, right? And it's not coming, right? It's like the power of magic is left in this room. Yeah, people are gonna, mark me down for that one. Okay, let's, one day when this comes up as API documentation, one thing to note is there's some other methods, and one of the methods we want to tap into when it comes to this thing is almost like this idea of go to and play, right? So if I look at my sprite sheet, here's my sprite sheet class, and as an example, I've loaded up my sprite sheets, I've done my little frames and all that kind of stuff, and you can see it's a kind of step-by-step example here, and I can generate sprite images and so on. Sometimes we have some cross-origin issues. You can kind of take away the origin and so on. But one of the things in methods is this idea of, I'll go to my index here. In my methods index, I have this idea of go to and play my animation. It's not here because, but this is what, it's kind of a holdback from the old Flash days, right? So remember, Grant Skinner came from Flash. He was the one that kind of worked on Flash, and he still works with Adobe, right? So he's the guy that created the library, and of course it's very Flash-like because the new Adobe Animate CC exports everything into Create.js. So if you're actually going to do something in Adobe Animate CC, some kind of animation on the stage, and you export your stage, and it actually makes a Create.js version of your Flash animation. Okay, cool. Well, what does that mean? If I go to Sprite, so Sprite Sheet's this. If I go to Sprite, and you can see there's other sprites thing as well. I have several methods in Sprite, like for example, go to and play. So I can go to and play a sprite, and I can also do something like go to and stop, right? So I can stop, I can play, and I can stop. I can start and stop an animation anytime I want, right? Well, if this is true, if I can start and stop an animation, I need an event listener. I need an event listener that says, well, when my animation's complete, right, then stop my animation, stop playing my animation. So I've got my explosion, but when it's done, don't play it anymore, right? And there's some stuff for that, right? So some events that you can do. Here's the event. There's a change event, right, for our animation end. This is the one you want, right? If I click on animation end, it gives you an idea of how this works, right? The animation end event, it gets dispatched when the animation reaches its ends, right? Which means if after you've done all your frames, so frame 4, 5, and 6 of my plane as an example, I'm at the end, I can listen for an animation end event, and on that event, I can do whatever the sprite is called. In this particular case, it's called player. I can go player.stop. And when I do that, it stops the propeller from animating, right? So it'll only animate once. And that's what you want for explosion. Explosion will animate, does its 8 frames or whatever, and when it's done exploding, stops, right? And then when it stops, inside that animation end, I want to hide the explosion. I don't want to get rid of it. And I'll tell you what, it's better to have an explosion pool, all right? Instead of loading up or instantiating new explosions all the time. Just like we did when we reset our objects. We have our cloud objects. They're off screen, and then they come down all the way to the bottom, and then reset the objects to the top of the screen again. And let's keep doing that over and over again, right? They reset at whatever rate you want them to. Same thing with explosions. We have a certain amount of explosions that are off screen or hidden. Their opacity or transparency is 100%, or opacity is 0. Alpha is 0, so you can't see alpha transparency, you can't see anything, right? And then when you need them, you reposition them where you want them, where the explosion took place, and make the opacity or alpha transparency 100%. So you see them now, and you start playing the animation. Say explosion.play, and also both it plays the explosion, and then you can listen for the explosion end of it. And that's how you do it. Now, in order for you to make this correct, you need another little class. And so you make an object called the explosion object. This is the way you do it. And in the explosion object itself, what you're going to do is you're going to make the event listener tied to every explosion object, but you're going to make an array of explosion objects, right? And that's going to be your explosion pool that you're going to reuse over and over again. You're going to just start and stop the explosion every single time. And typically, you have to kind of gauge how many you need, right? how many explosions do you think I'd probably need for male pilot if I was going to hit? Right now, I only can explode with the cloud. So what's the maximum number of times I can get hit by the cloud? Maybe 3, 4. So I probably only need like 3 or 4 explosions at once, ever, right? If that. So if I make a little array of 4 explosions, right? And all I'm doing is, well, if the last explosion went off, go to the next explosion, right? So I can have some kind of global object. And by the way, this goes back to more framework. Look at what I'm building here. I'm building it with you in my mind, okay? I'm dreaming, okay, for a second with you guys. Dreaming. And I want to make an explosion manager, right? We just made a collision manager. I'll make an explosion manager with its own class that I call, that's going to manage all the explosions, right, from happening, almost like a game controller or an explosion controller object that controls all the explosions that I put into place wherever I want them, right? That way, I have total control of where they appear, when they're played, when they stop, and which explosion is playing and which is not, right? So that way I have control. If I do it any other way, if you try to instantiate an explosion, that means you'll have a bunch of different explosions objects hanging out everywhere that you have to clean up afterwards. This is bad. You just want to have a set number, 4, 5, whatever you choose is the right number. Here's something else. If I enable bullet firing in my game, which I could do, right? And I'm hitting other objects with it, like for example, planes. If there's other enemy planes coming down in my game, and I'm hitting the other objects, that might need more explosions or different kinds of explosions. And therefore, I may need more of these explosion types, that I have. So I might, instead of having only 4, I might have 8, whatever it is. But you want to instantiate all your objects first in game before when you load. Once I'm loaded, I'm good to go, right? Because I've instantiated all my objects. So my loading is all done. Now I can play the game with a consistent experience. If you load stuff as you go, your game will slow down and speed up, and it'll be a terrible experience for the player, right? So please don't do that. And really hard on your hardware, because you're going to load and kind of create and stop. And actually, this methodology that I'm talking about, it doesn't just apply here to Create.js, but it also applies to Unity, Unreal, name the game engine, 3JS, whatever it is. It'll apply to all that. You want to load up everything you can first, create your object pools, and then from there, when you're done playing the game, all your object pools are released, right? You don't want to do them as you go. So I'm not going to show you the explosion. I'm sure you can figure it out yourself, because explosion is going to take us another hour to do properly, because we have to make an explosion class, an explosion manager, blah, 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 and create it, and then how to make the explosions happen, and what happens when my explosion happens. Does my plane come back, does it flicker back and forth? So I have a little bit of, it just died, right? Do I reset my plane? What do I do with it, right? But yes, and you could do it. And what happens if I go and hit my cloud multiple times? Do I have multiple explosions? Obviously not. You have to fix that problem. But we already fixed it, because then you would have multiple sounds. We've already fixed that problem. You fix multiple sounds, you fix multiple explosions, right? That issue. So those are the things that you have to kind of take care of. So it's going to take us about another hour, and I'd really rather sit with you guys and look at your projects. All right? Questions around this? There are some great examples I've got up on my, in my the portfolio of videos that I have up on YouTube, now numbering well over 900. I don't know how I got there, but crazy videos, right? Go there if you want to look at past videos on how to do explosions. If you go back, it's a couple of years back, actually. If you look at the COMP397 library, you can look back and see how I've done explosions in the past. They're there. I've also outlined some other things, right? So if you really want to do explosions, you can do it, right? Worst case scenario, if you want me to help you build it, like if this is one thing you really want in your game, you want an explosion, right? I can help you with it over the next week or so. Okay, so but I won't do it here in class. I'll do it as individuals need it. So that's it for me for today. I'm going to sit with everybody else now. Let's take a short break for people who have been trying to pay attention to my words for the last hour or so. Go out, do your bio break, come back, and then I'll start sitting with everybody else. Okay.